Thanks for joining us today. I'm Rachel Seward. I'm the Deputy CEO of WACOSS, and I'm your facilitator for today. As we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the Whadjuk Noongar people, the traditional custodians of the land on which WACOSS is situated and where I am today, and many of you are, but I'd also like to acknowledge traditional owners throughout Western Australia and Australia, because I know some of you are coming from interstate, and acknowledge their ongoing custodianship of the land on which we are all privileged to live. Also acknowledge that this land was never ceded, it's stolen land, and we have a lot of unfinished business to which both WACOSS and I know our members are committed to addressing. It's also the season of durian here in Whadjuk Noongar country, Budja, I should say, and that's reflects the changing of the seasons from the hot season to the cooler season. And those of you that live here in Bulu will have noticed very strongly that it has moved to a cooler season. And it constantly reminds me of how right the First Nations people and the Noongar community got the season. So instead of the 4, there's 6, and it truly does reflect our seasonality here and a deep understanding of country here in Western Australia. Emerging Issues is a forum that we hold once a year to take a time out of our really busy days to reflect on some of the issues that are affecting and will affect the work that we do over the next 12 months and into the future. Often because, and particularly at the moment with so many things happening, it's really good to be able to take a bit of time out to reflect on some of the issues that are going to impact and shape some of the work that we do into the future. And we've got 3 excellent speakers today. I'm really excited to hear from them. And our first speaker is Amy Ramekis, and she's the Chief Political Analyst at the Australia Institute. But I'm sure many of you will know her from the work that she's done with her incisive political commentary and extensive experience as a journalist, author, and former Guardian Australia political reporter. I used to read all the time. She regularly appears in the national media and is celebrated for her powerful writing on gender, politics, and social justice. Her work continues to influence the public debate and policy discussions across Australia. Welcome, Amy. We're very lucky to have you with us today. Over to you.
Oh, thank you for that lovely introduction. I'm coming to you from the land of the Bunurong people in the Kulin Nation. I'm currently in Sorrento for a writers' festival and had the misfortune this morning of bumping into Tony Abbott as I was walking into my hotel. So pray for me. I am thrilled to be speaking to you about emerging issues. I'm a poor substitute for Dr. Emma Shortis, who was going to be speaking with you today, but she's had a scheduling conflict. And what she wanted me to say to you on her behalf is, yes, you are not crazy. It is as bad as it seems. But on the flip side of that, there is actually a lot of hope and opportunity in the political situation at the moment. And we know that Donald Trump has completely destroyed what was left of international law and international order. And that should matter to Australia a lot more than it does. We currently have a government that it prefers to sort of say nothing rather than condemn the United States and Israel for its actions. But there is also hope there too. It kind of went a little bit unnoticed, but Australia signed up a statement with the Global South as well as the UK calling for Lebanon to be part of any ceasefire agreement between the US, Israel, and Iran. And that was in contradiction to what the United States and Israel had wanted. And it is indicative of the fact that the global order is reforming, it is reordering itself. And because Australia needs currently fuel and other resources which have to come from the Global South, south, our diplomatic lines are starting to reorder themselves as well. And while it might not be getting a lot of attention, it's certainly something to be paying attention to. And you can also internationally take heart from the clear signal, particularly from Australia, that is coming from people and their rejection of Trump and Netanyahu's violent, lawless view of the world that is being shown in Australia across multiple polls. It was also a pretty big factor in the last federal election, and it's only getting stronger. And it also points to the fact that Australia actually has a lot of power and agency in order to act on the world stage, certainly more than it currently is. While Australia's governments and opposition, Labor, it doesn't matter. They like to paint us as being powerless. We are anywhere between the 13th and the 15th biggest economy in the world, depending on how you order that at any given time. We were one of the founding members of the United Nations. We were one of the founding members of the Security Council. We were one of the first nations that gave peacekeeping troops when it was necessary in Indonesia. We've had a very big role to play in forming the world as it is. And currently, we don't seem to have the political will to do anything about that to help reshape that order now that it is falling apart. But when we look a little bit closer domestically and have a look at some of those trends, we are still seeing a continued decline in the major party vote. And that is, the rise of One Nation is part of it. But I would also point you to some of the data, which shows that this has been a trend which has been going on since the 1980s, pretty much since neoliberalism started to really take hold in Australia, where we're starting to see the major party system be dismantled. And there is, that can be frightening for some people, but there is also quite a lot of opportunity in there. And I think when we're watching what happens in the domestic political space, South Australia's election is probably a better demonstration of what could happen in Victoria. Of course, you have to make adjustments for Peter Malinowskis's relative popularity compared to Jacinta Allen's relative unpopularity, but it's still a better guide of what could happen to Victoria and indeed federally at the next election than what will happen in Farrer, which is a very concentrated by-election. But you can also count on the fact that the narrative, particularly what the legacy media will follow, will be what happens in Farrer rather than what happens wider in Victoria. So that's one thing to keep an eye on for. And also when people start talking about the fact that we might start seeing more of a fractured vote, which means that we're going to see less of this two-party system where you have a government and then a one-party opposition, our Westminster democracy is absolutely capable of handling multi-party democracy. It always has been. It's been built that way. Before World War II, it's pretty much what we did. It's only been since World War II that we've really gone, oh, you have two major parties. It doesn't have to be the case. And while people often say, well, you need a strong opposition in order to have a strong democracy, I disagree. I think in order to have a strong democracy, you need to have a strong parliament. It doesn't necessarily rely on an opposition or being one party. It relies on strong democratic representation in the parliament. So there is, we're seeing that trend emerge where you're going to see more independents and minor parties. And it's just something to keep an eye on because you're also going to see at the same time a lot of chaos and confusion if you don't stick to the major parties. We've also seen the major parties try to shore up their future as much as possible by using political finance regimes. So the last 10 to 15 years has seen political finance reform, which, most people know as donations reform, which is meant to be getting power out of politics. But in reality, because they're deals that have largely been stitched up by the major parties, what it does is it gives tax-funded incumbents. So if you're in the parliament currently, you benefit from these sorts of things, but it does tend to give fewer opportunities for new entrants. That is not a bug of the system, that is by design. They want to be able to shore up their own way of doing things to ensure that they can have as much head start as possible and try and head off this decline in the major party vote. But we have seen the High Court in Victoria recently throw out Victoria's political finance regulation because of the pro-major party loophole that was available in there. We could see another half a dozen or so examples of preferential treatment being highlighted across state, territory, and federal laws, which is particularly important for the next election, given that Labor and the coalition in the last parliament stitched up a deal to be able to give more public funding to incumbents, but severely limit what new entrants, so new minor parties and new independents, would be able to spend and how they would be able to spend it in electorates. So people have gotten wise to the idea that restrictions on political finance, being pro-integrity, is usually about setting up the existing ecosystem. We've also seen from the federal government a shift towards they're calling progressive patriotism, which is kind of trying to borrow a little bit of what John Curtin and Ben Chiefeley did in post-war Australia. It's basically meant to be Australia versus globalized nationalism. And you can see the defeat of Orban in Hungary as shining a light on how people are sort of trying to take back their countries from what has been a somewhat corrupted process in a lot of nations, including the United States. The Albanese government way of doing progressive patriotism has so far focused on manufacturing. So they want to bring back manufacturing, but they've been unable to link it to things that would have a material difference in everybody's life, like a gas tax, for instance, which, you know, the ACTU 25% export tax on all gas exports, which the Australia Institute did research on and found could raise up to $17 billion a year, which could fund things like the NDIS, like a raise in welfare, which could better fund health, better fund schools, education, all the rest of it. Labor has not been able to link their we want to manufacture things in Australia to those sorts of things because they're still captured by certain industries, not necessarily financially, but certainly culturally. And whenever you speak to someone from Labor about why aren't you doing these things, they usually say that they don't think that the public is there yet, which I would suggest is not maybe having your finger on the pulse. So we're unsure too when they talk about progressive patriotism, which is something that Anthony Albanese has been talking about since he was re-elected. It's been one of his catchphrases, but we don't know whether that's about, you know, Medicare and building vaccines and research and development in Australia, or whether it's Australian-made missiles, because there is still an undercurrent of this government following in the footsteps of what Malcolm Turnbull put in place to make Australia one of the top 10 arms dealers in the world. And so we have a burgeoning defence industry, but people are starting to ask at what cost, not just at what human cost we are putting out into the world, but what domestic cost that is also coming at as well. We've also seen some of the Greens and some of the independents like Allegra Spender and Jackie Lambie. They've all got their own takes on patriotism as well. And a lot of that is coming as trying to be a bit of a ballast against One Nation and its false nationalism. So One Nation is a vessel of grievance. It is collecting those grievances at the moment. It doesn't necessarily have policies. It doesn't necessarily have answers, but it is telling people that they're able to be angry. And that is enough at the moment. Whether or not people start looking for actual solutions as we get closer to the election is something that is still unknown. It will depend a lot on how the government responds to people's anger in this coming budget, which will be handed down next month. And our democratic institutions are something that Australia can be proud of in terms of what's protecting us from some of the backstepping of democracy that we're seeing in the United Kingdom and particularly the United States, which is neither of those nations are considered liberal democracies anymore by the Variety of Democracies project because of their crackdown on civil liberties. But Australia is also seeing a similar crackdown. We have so far been vindicated, I suppose, by the courts, which have stepped in a lot of times. The most recent example being Chris Minns' New South Wales laws, cracking down on democratic protest and peaceful assembly. But the attempts to continue to crack down on democratic dissent are only ramping up. And while we should be proud of our institutions like our Independent Electoral Commission and other statutory bodies that do help protect us from a lot of what we're seeing in the United States, they could be stronger. And if Australia ever had a competent fascist at the helm, which is not outside the realm of possibility, there is not a lot from them appointing whoever they wanted to some of our head agencies because we don't have a lot of controls around that. We tend to rely on good faith and the idea that people will do the right thing rather than having actual protections in place. So, for example, if you had a competent fascist who wanted to put Australia's version of RFK Jr. In charge of, the TGA or something to do with one of our health authorities, that's a direct appointment. There's not a lot that would be there to stop them from being able to do that. And people are starting to question that in some of the Canberra circles as they're watching what's happening to democracies around the world. In terms of what we're not seeing from the Albanese government and things not to expect from them over the next 12 months. No truth in political advertising, no expansion of the parliament, no extra senators for the territories. They've tried exceptionally hard to pass bad freedom of information laws, which would have limited transparency and information even further. And they have failed to pass their social media misinformation laws as well. State governments are still trying to restrict protest, even in the face of the High Court knocking them back. So there is quite a lot to pay attention to in there. The first battle is going to be the coming budget, where the government is looking like doing some things when it comes to at least restricting the CGT, capital gains tax discount and negative gearing. They've made some little tinkering around the private health rebate that allowed people over 65 to get a bit bigger discount on their private health insurance than younger people. And of course, they've just announced massive cuts to the NDIS while increasing defence spending. And Anthony Albanese is still ruling out doing anything on an export tax, despite pretty much every major economist, including Ken Henry, the former Treasury Secretary, who wrote a white paper on tax reform, telling a Senate committee that it was crazy not to consider changing those taxes around our gas industry. So there's a new kind of acronym that's floating around. Some of you may have heard that Trump always chickens out, which is TACO. We're now starting to hear Labor always chickens out, which is LACO, or Labor always makes excuses, which is LAME. So feel free to do whatever you need to do with those acronyms as we go into the budget. But also remember, the budget is not the end of the fight. If the battles to decrease inequality and sort of address some of the structural issues within Australia due to that inequality are not won, just means the fight's beginning. It's certainly not over.
Thank you so much, Amy. Really appreciate your very astute analysis of the current situation, and it has plenty of implications for our sector in terms of if decisions are made that impact on the most vulnerable Australians, those that are vulnerable to the system, those on low incomes. the cuts that are being made affect them. But if you then look at, as you've just described, you get people in place that aren't supportive of the programs that are currently operating, we could see massive cuts, for example, to programs, but also the flow-on effects to people's health, such as if we got anti-vaxxers in, as you were just giving an example of. Thank you. What I forgot to mention at the beginning is that we are going to have a panel session at the end of our 3 talks. So please write down your questions, because I'm sure you'll have them, and you will get an opportunity for us to ask those questions. So please write them down and keep them in mind. I'd now like to hand over to Professor Michelle Crosman. Michelle's going to be speaking on shared belonging and social cohesion in times of conflict and crisis. She's the director of the Centre for Resilient and Inclusive Societies. She is the research chair in diversity and community resilience at Deakin University and director of the Centre for Resilience and Inclusive Societies, CRIS. She's a leading researcher on preventing and countering violent extremism, and she founded and co-convenes the Avert Research Network and has shaped national and international policy through her work on community reporting, resilience, and radicalisation prevention. She was appointed as a member of the Order of Australia in 2023 for her significant service to tertiary education, particularly through research and social welfare. Very eminently qualified to speak to us today. Thank you for joining us, Michelle, and over to you.
Thank you, Rachel. It's an absolute pleasure to be here with you and Amy and Megan and everybody else. And as we go, I would also like to acknowledge where I sit, which is on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. I would like to pay my respects to their elders, ancestors, as well as to any Indigenous and other First Nations people who may be with us today. So my slides are going to be run now by WACOSS. Thank you very much, Maya. And if we could go right into the next slide, thanks. We'll get stuck in. Unlike Amy, sorry, I'm an academic, so a bit more telling you about some things in terms of background and context, perhaps, as we get stuck in. And I hope you can bear with me. So, look, one of the things as an academic that I always like to do is sort of outline how I'm using particular terms. And in this case, really talking about what shared belonging is or might be, and how it relates to social cohesion. And don't worry, I'm not going to read every single word out here. This is a background for you to be able to take away afterwards. So, social belonging, which is sometimes also called social connectedness or sense of belonging, this is really a very fundamental feature of human nature and also human society. And it is a need, and it is about feeling connected to and being accepted by others in positive ways. Now, one of the things that I find very helpful when I think about shared and social belonging is to think about the spaces where that kind of belonging happens. And so I've picked out the 3 that I think are particularly important in our world today. We can think about spaces of belonging in terms of physical spaces, public transport, schools, clinics, or local neighborhoods. They can also be narrative spaces, right? Shared belonging also revolves around the stories that we tell, both to and about each other, in both the past and the present. They can be about the political dialogues that occur between people, for example, citizens in the same country. And of course, the third big space of belonging these days is digital space, right? Digital spaces on social media and the internet, which absolutely saturate daily life in a number of respects. So feeling a sense of belonging in these physical or narrative or digital spaces absolutely means feeling that you, and by extension, the group or groups that you belong to, are welcome and accepted and seen as legitimate. Socially speaking, shared belonging also means feeling able to interact with each other, and that includes both people who are like you, but also critically people who are not like you know, with relative freedom and safety, and physical safety, but also cultural safety. So, you know, you can see from this that shared belonging is very much bound up with the idea of what I call accommodation, right? So literally, you know, what does accommodation mean? It means making room for, yeah? So making room for others who have an equal claim to the spaces that you occupy and managing that relationship between you and others so that you can occupy these spaces together. When I say equal claims, one of the ways that you can think of the idea of equal claims to a space is around citizenship, right? Citizenship is an example where you say, you know, citizens of nation X have equal rights to the spaces that we occupy as a country. Now, shared belonging can sometimes, however, be predicated on histories of unequal claims and efforts to disaccommodate others. Colonial occupation is one of the really obvious ones there, including in Australia. So, you know, you can have a history of unequal claims, denial of accommodation that can often shadow efforts to share belonging in the present. Beyond that, there is no question that what we are seeing today, locally and globally, is, you know, a capacity for shared belonging that accommodates others with equal claims but different identities is under huge and perpetual strain. And these strains are political, cultural, economic, ideological, sometimes historical, and they become especially sharpened in times of conflict and crisis. And as we're going to see, they can, you know, have some pretty corrosive effects on social cohesion as well. So if we can go to the next slide, thanks. So let's talk for a moment about social cohesion. Social cohesion at its root means, you know, fostering increased connection and understanding and solidarity from people who come from different backgrounds. And the goal of social cohesion is to say, what do we have in common and what are our common goals around social well-being and thriving? And I always like to go in my, you know, earlier life, I was a literary and cultural studies academic. I always like to go back to the original meanings of terms, often coming from the Latin or the Greek. So cohesion literally means sticking together, right? You know, like glue, coming together with. In the way that we're talking about it now, social cohesion can be a concept, a value set, and a practice. As a concept, social cohesion asks us to think about what helps us stick together and work towards those common goals of social well-being, despite or indeed based on our differences, rather than allowing them to divide us. As a value set, social cohesion is like a proposition, and it's a proposition that asserts that the benefits of sticking together in a community or society are more important and bring better satisfaction and rewards and security, again, than focusing on what sets us apart. But as a practice, social cohesion asks that we make the conscious effort to accept and work with and through our social and cultural differences in order to find and also nurture that common ground that we share. And that common ground might revolve around, for example, fair distribution of social goods, how our society should be governed, how vulnerable members of communities should be treated by institutions and systems, and so on. Now, social cohesion does not mean just sticking together with people who are like you, which in social capital theory is called bonding capital. It actually means reaching out and connecting with people who are not like you. And that is called bridging capital, literally walking across the bridge to difference. So social cohesion is not to be confused with a concept like social harmony. Social harmony tries to erase difference, right? It says, okay, we're going to just pretend that our differences don't exist. That's not really a healthy way to live. So social cohesion instead is about our ability to acknowledge difference and sometimes conflict and to manage difference and conflict in ways that demonstrate empathy and respect and, where possible, safety for everyone who's involved. So it's a little bit different than the social harmony concept. We could have the next slide, thanks. Okay, so this is a shorty. Yes, the slides will be made available. This is a shorty. I'm just put here the definition of social cohesion from the Canadian Policy Research people in '98, a recent one from the Mapping Social Cohesion people at the Scanlon Foundation in 2022, to show you that in 25 years, the difference between '98 and 2022, give or take, very little has changed. So our ideas about what social cohesion is have remained pretty stable. Belonging, sense of worth, social inclusion and justice, participation, legitimacy, recognition, and acceptance or rejection, particularly around migrants and discrimination. So these ideas around what social cohesion is, as I say, have remained very stable over time. If we could go to the next slide, thanks. Okay, now what is the opposite of social cohesion? So in the work that I do, we tend to look at the opposite phenomenon of what we call social exclusivism, right? So a few years ago, when we did a systematic lit review on social cohesion and community resilience and violent extremism for the Victorian government, we said the following. Exclusivism is used as an umbrella term for a set of attitudes and actions informed by the assumption of inequality between groups, and especially the superiority of one's own group. So exclusivist viewpoints tend to define group boundaries in very rigid terms based on assumed fixed sets of values and traits, in-out criteria. Not all forms of exclusivism are necessarily socially harmful, but those that aim to humiliate, denigrate, and harm others are socially harmful. And when you sort of review this and compare it to definitions of extremism, gee, they're pretty adjacent. Okay, so often you find that socially exclusivist attitudes and orientations are, if not extremist in and of themselves, pretty adjacent to extremist ways of thinking, but we can explore that maybe in the panel discussion. So I would argue that social exclusivism is now mainstreaming and indeed spiraling in Australia. So the loss of the Voice Referendum, the rise of support for One Nation, the Liberal Party's recent shift to a very hard right immigration policy, the rise of the extreme right, so most predominantly neo-Nazis and white supremacists, coupled with rising anti-Semitism, rising Islamophobia, both those trends already in place, but really spiking, broadening cross-generational inequalities in housing and job security. They are all signs of the trend of social exclusivism, in my view. And as a result, we are seeing the fraying of social cohesion and the intensifying of social exclusivism for both individuals and groups. And this is across media, politics, education, the economy, and labor markets. Now, the global tensions created by the Israel-Gaza conflict following the Hamas terrorist attacks in 2023, Israel's continuing response to those attacks, combined with various countries, increasing bellicosity towards foreign allies, as well as adversaries. Amy touched on this in terms of the overturning of the existing world order. All of this has seen both the idea and the practice of social cohesion in Australia weaken. And we are seeing social exclusivism accelerate in ways that really run counter to what I would consider national complacencies around shared belonging and its implied meanings of accommodation and sticking together in times of crisis. So what I'm really getting at here is that we like to tell ourselves a story about cohesion and resilience, and sometimes the facts don't actually bear that story out. It's a consoling narrative or a consoling fiction, but it's also a complacency. Next slide, thanks. So, let me look now to some of the factors that I think are really, affecting and eroding our sense of shared belonging and social cohesion. One of the really, really big ones is, mis, dis, and malinformation on social and other media. So we are absolutely swamped at the moment with both misinformation and disinformation. Just quickly to review the difference between those two. Misinformation is basically just information that is not factually correct. It's not evidence-based. It's wrong if you're a fact-based person like me. But it's also innocent in the sense that people aren't necessarily intending it to be harmful. Disinformation is intended to be harmful. It is intended to be divisive. People think of disinformation as being connected with malign foreign actors, for example, in terms of things like foreign espionage and interference, but it is also a very common tactic used by extremists. So media echo chambers, peer pressure, malicious actors, meme culture, it's just everywhere. And levels of education have very little to do with it. It's a very, very quick personal anecdote. I was in hospital recently, in an emergency room with an acute asthma attack, and a very well-educated doctor who was wonderful in all respects when she found out what I did for a living and, focused on violent extremism. She said, "So tell me, was 9/11 really a hoax?" I practically had a heart attack in addition to the asthma attack. But that was an example to me of misinformation, right? From somebody, who was pretty well educated. We also have declining levels of everyday local neighborhood contact in our communities. Ride the train every day. And what do you see is a lot of people, either they're looking at their phones or they have their headphones on, or they have the headphones on and they're stuck on their phones. The kind of social interaction that we used to take for granted in public space and in local communities. Is it declining? Some would say yes, some no. Certainly it's changing. So the idea from contact theory that everyday neighborhood diversity and exchange has now been replaced by digital community and digital connectivity. But that sense of equality between groups is now steadily eroding as a result, particularly in relation to policy and distribution of social and material goods. Big crises like climate change and economic precarity, housing insecurity, they all promote a sense of powerlessness for people, while protest activism can often create a sense of efficacy and empowerment. So they make people feel as if those crises might be manageable, but actually those things are not effective in driving structural change. So what I'm trying to bring about here is that people feel as if they're doing something, but actually what they're doing is expressing their sense of powerlessness. They're not actually making the change, the structural change that we need to correct for some of these inequalities and corrosive elements around shared belonging. Certainly, we have increased acceptance of polarization now as a social norm, and this is a devastating development. So we see the normalization and indeed the celebration of polarization in countries like the United States and a number of others that I can think of. I would have said until recently, polarization was rejected by the Australian population in general, and I think electoral results have largely borne that out. I would not be so confident today in saying that polarization is now rejected, and I think that we need to have a strong conversation about what it means to start to try to push that kind of polarization back. And finally, and I think Amy touched on this as well, there are very ambivalent community and government attitudes now towards social activism and dissent. So when I first arrived in Australia in 1987, and these were that was the period into the 90s, enormous protests, right? A lot of them were union protests. Nobody ever questioned the right of people to be out on the street protesting, being heard, being vocal. It was sacrosanct. It was a sacrosanct part of Australian culture and politics. Well, boy, it is not sacrosanct anymore. So, peaceful social protest is now exciting both government and community hostility. And that is a problem for democracy, and it is a problem for shared belonging, because the message is that your voice can't be heard, and that you cannot raise your voice in protest and dissent. That is not healthy for a democracy, and it is not healthy for shared belonging. But there are related problems around identity politics that are informing a kind of social activism based on who you are rather than what you think or what you value, loss of nuance in social activist strategies that are leading to a climate of increased anger and fear, and community orthodoxies on all sides of a debate that can shut down internal debate and disagreement. So in some ways, that ambivalence is coming from within social movements, I would argue, as well as from those who are opposed to them. Let's go to the last slide, thanks. What can we do to enhance genuine shared belonging in this rather bleak climate, that we've been talking about? So, not really rocket science, I would say. We certainly need to think about how we connect with each other through physical and narrative and digital means, but I would be putting the emphasis back on physical connection, which is to say connecting in physical public spaces, right? And also narrative. The digital is already looking after itself in some ways. We need to be inclusive, but that means including people we don't automatically think of including. When you go down your head, who am I going to invite to my birthday, or who am I going to invite to a neighborhood thing? There's always a group of people that you automatically think of, right? Those are what they call your near ties, but it's your distant ties. And in fact, it's people you don't have ties with at all that we need to start consciously making the effort to include in what we do. Listening, but also talking. Yes. We don't do enough listening, but sometimes we also need to talk. Australians, I've noticed over the 39 years I've been here, can be very hesitant, unlike New Yorkers like me, to insert themselves into a conversation. But sometimes talking is how we learn about each other and learn about the differences that we need to navigate. Absolutely respecting people, constructively arguing and debating those with whom we disagree, advocating for social justice, for fairness and dignity and equality, but in doing that advocacy work, avoiding cancel culture and other power plays, because in my view, cancel culture is a power play, avoiding power plays that seek to exclude or shut down rather than connect and foster understanding, even with people that you disagree with. Accepting that in some cases we won't be able to share viewpoints or values, but that part of shared belonging is accepting that some differences are just going to persist. Rejecting polarization, as I said before, which tends to migrate towards extremes, in favor of finding and affirming that common ground that lies at the heart of social cohesion. And understanding, and where possible, and this is really important, agreeing on thresholds for harm versus well-being. And that means social harms, cultural harms, political harms, and digital harms. So the relationship between shared belonging and safety can be misunderstood, but there are thresholds for what is acceptable and what is not acceptable in terms of social safety and well-being. What we're missing at the moment is broad agreement on where those thresholds are. And that is a really, really important conversation nationally to have, and one that will strengthen a sense of shared belonging once we can come to some kind of consensus. And I think that is it for me. Yes. So thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Michelle. There's been a number of people already asking for you, or there's been people already asking for your slides, so we will make sure that they are available. That I'm sure a lot of all of our people that are on this webinar will have taken a lot from what you've just articulated, and there's some really strong, clear messaging there, and also clear things for the sector to be looking at. Now, I am just checking to see, Megan, are you online now?
Yeah, I am. Hang on.
Okay.
Sorry.
Fantastic.
This is like a military operation trying to get
Megan.
you. Thank you.
Thanks so much for joining us. So Professor Megan Davis is going to be speaking to us about the landscape post Voice Referendum, what lies ahead for First Nations justice and Australia's democratic future. Megan is a scientific
Scientia. It's okay.
Yes, Scientia.
Nobody knows how to pronounce it. So.
Yeah, it's a bit hard for me. I was trying to say science. Pro Vice Chancellor Society and Belanavis Chair in Constitutional Law at the University of New South Wales in Sydney, a leading constitutional lawyer specialising in Indigenous people's rights, democratic design and First Nations constitutional recognition, internationally recognised for her central role in the Uluru Statement from the Heart. Professor Davis currently serves as the Harvard University Gough Whitlam and Malcolm Fraser Chair in Australian Studies and visiting professor at the Harvard Law School. I'm sure most of you will know the leading role that Megan has played in First Nations issues in Australia for a very long time. Thanks for joining us, Megan, and over to you.
Thanks. You can hear me, can't you?
Yes, we sure can.
Great. Hi, everyone. Sorry, I had to rush to this room to give these comments, and there's this bizarre light here, and then there's this weird shine, I think, on the screen. So forgive me for that. I know it probably makes me look like an angel. I'm joking. So thank you, Rachel, for the invitation to talk today. So I'm going to talk a bit about the post referendum environment for Indigenous policy. And I make those comments because in the context of the international issues we are also referring to, I left Australia about 6 months after the referendum to take up a chair at Harvard. So it was their kind of pre-Trump selection and then post-Trump selection. And so some of the insights into, some of the insights I'll share today come from watching Australia from afar and watching the last election. I wanted to begin by just making a few points about the referendum at the beginning, and I'll make some more comments at the end. I think one of the important points that I think is shared by a lot of First Nations people is the speed with which Australia wanted to move on from that result. As soon as the Prime Minister and Linda Burney very kind of happily and eagerly did their press conference that night, and then a couple of days later, Richard Marles made the comment that the Australian people never get it wrong. There's been, very little, I think, proper analysis of the referendum and what went wrong. And I make that context particularly in the space of disinformation, because of course it was a campaign that was severely hampered by the levels of acute disinformation playing out across social media, etc. Yet when you look at all of the kind of contemporary reports about the alarming implications of disinformation for Australian democracy, the referendum is very rarely mentioned. There's a number of reports in recent weeks, a national security report about climate change and disinformation, a parliamentary inquiry about the disinformation ecosystem, but for Jeremy Walker, it's virtually not mentioned, which I find really interesting. And I just wanted to make one point about that. And that is the kind of asymmetrical application of the criteria of what disinformation is in Australia to particular policy areas. If you look at what people are saying is disinformation in the climate change space, we had all the same actors and characteristics play out in our referendum. But apparently our referendum was a judicious decision of the Australian people, or a judicious decision, as some pundits have written about the model. What we know from the research is they didn't even get to the part where the model was discussed. And so I've been making that point to a lot of climate change policy people. If you can't make the case for the 2023 referendum as having been what most political scientists will say, the arrival of disinformation in a really post-truth Trump era in Australia, then, the kind of, as the parliamentary inquiry found, the contested definition of what is disinformation in any space arguably doesn't isn't made out for climate change either. And so I just wanted to make that point because it's not just me, but many of us have noticed that Indigenous issues, and in particular the referendum, is just missing from public policy discourse and debate in Australia at the moment. And I point to reports like the McKinnon report on democracy, not even a mention of Indigenous peoples. The Grattan Institute report was a bit better, and it did mention the deliberative dialogues at Uluru, or leading to Uluru, as an important example of the ways in which we can involve citizens in decision making. But I wanted to make that point from the outset. It's not lost on First Nations people, the absence of discussion by the Australian people and by the Australian media of what happened in that referendum, and how quickly the caravan moved on. And just, I would listen to Amy and Michelle, both great presos, both amazing women whose work I read really closely. And I wanted to echo Amy's point about the AEC. It was really apparent to me from Australia, there's a certain smugness we have about compulsory voting in Australia and the democracy sausage. I wanted to make a point about that, and that is, in a lot of scholarship across the world and a lot of analysis about democracy, the ballot box is, the fixation on the ballot box is part of the problem. And in countries that have compulsory voting, there's a tendency to be really smug about everybody turning up to vote, and then less attention is paid to the quality of your democracy. Political scientists do say that one of the problems of non-compulsory voting, which I support, so compulsory voting, is that citizens tend to vote and see that as their civic contribution. And so you see not a lot between the ballot box. And I think that's played out over the years by the OECD testing of Australian kids who sit down the bottom of a spectrum of countries, America at the top, who find it difficult to explain how you would influence politics outside of the ballot box. And I just wanted to make one point on Michelle's comment about the draconian laws. I gave a paper to a bunch of judges in Alice Springs on the weekend and made this point, which is the draconian laws relating to movement and speech, protests, the draconian laws are actually deeply embedded in the Australian legal DNA. Yeah, they're antecedents of the draconian laws that we use for the control and protection of Aboriginal people. So it's deeply embedded in Australia. And I think the debate, and I've noticed that in relation to, in particular, the Min's protest laws, just the complete absence of that analysis. And I think when we think about the rule of law, and when we're speaking about the rule of law in Australia, we often forget that actually a lot of the really punitive laws, like the punitive preventative detention laws and others, they all have their antecedents in the reserves and missions and other forms of legislation that were applied in the pre-Federation colonial parliamentary life of Aboriginal people and post-Federation. And so I think that's an important point to make. I think the Grattan Institute is one of the few that picks up on the remaining racism that sits in the Constitution. We know from the research that a lot of Australians who voted no said they didn't want race in the Constitution. We know that it's deeply imbued in the Constitution. And so it's not just a matter of civics education to Australian people. It's a matter of us actually expounding upon this history and the kind of manifestation of those laws today. I'll park that because I also don't agree with, right now, a truth-telling process or reverting to truth-telling as being some way out of the problems that Indigenous peoples have in relation to Australia. And I'll return to that at the end with my, 5 minutes left, because I've taken it all up. So I'm going to be really quick. I actually had a little speech here, but I think I might just quickly talk off the cuff. The first point I wanted to make was about fragmentation. So in the post-referendum environment, what most people are seeing is a fragmentation of Indigenous policy and groups right across the Federation. So that's partly driven by closing the gap. Closing the gap was the problematic framework pre voice pre-Uluru that had led to the decision-making around a voice to Parliament. That is to say, people actually don't agree that community control and other peak organisations speak for them. That's partly to do with Corporations Acts and Aboriginal Corporations Acts and the nature of boards, and whether or not boards are truly representative in a self-determination sense. And I think that's being made out in the kind of post-referendum space. But closing the gap is a problem for many. It is now pretty much all the government does under the umbrella of, and I'm talking about the federal government here, in Indigenous policy. It has its tentacles in everything. So I even supervised a student the other day from a particular department, and the department sent me a note saying that they were going to write that up as their contribution to priority XYZ of closing the gap. It's now permeating, it's not just the federal government, state government, but also local government. And it's a very difficult environment where people can see the framework doesn't work. We know from the results that the framework isn't working, but also everybody's too scared to say anything because they don't want to lose their funding. So that's a problem. The language of partnership, co-design, sharing, all of the kinds of words that public policy comes up with to kind of rubber stamp the work that they're doing in this space doesn't really fool anyone. There is an acute power imbalance. And if we think back to the Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody, which I appreciate is dated, it's 30 years old, but at the time they said that the most important thing for Aboriginal people going forward was to have agency and for bureaucrats to remove themselves from communities and from decision making. And I think in the post-referendum environment, we've just seen a complete doubling down and entrenchment of that. So closing the gap is part of that fragmentation. The other thing is reconciliation. That remains a framework that was rejected by virtually every dialogue in the Uluru dialogues, not because people don't like people involved in reconciliation. It's difficult to talk about this because people get personally offended, but the framework is problematic. And I just refer everybody to how it was adopted by Hawke Keating. And it was adopted off the back of the decision not to adopt national land rights or treaty, but to find a way out of the broken promises. And reconciliation was adopted at the time. It was a 1990s fad in South Australia and South Africa and Latin America. It was picked up in a statute that they passed called the Council for Aboriginal Reconciliation. We had 10 years of that work, intensive truth-telling. We get to the Howard years, which Amy's written about. Howard completely rips up the reconciliation agenda. And it's another 10 years before we have Gillard, and the Greens and the two independents force Gillard into a constitutional recognition process. The point I'm making here is truth-telling is a can-kicking exercise for any government. Globally, the evidence shows that by and large they don't work. And if we were to go down that track as a consolation prize to something substantive like The Voice, we'll be another 2 decades in the wilderness, and our people need change now. I've got 2 minutes, so I'll hurry up. So I think those 2 points are important to make. The third element I just wanted to throw in was the Albanese economic development policy, or the Albanese economic transformation policy, or the Albanese economic empowerment policy. So this is a new policy. It's not really a new policy when you think about it, because economic development has been a primary agenda of the federal government for 40, 50 years. It's just it never works. Post-referendum, they have been saying that social policy is dead, that the referendum vote is definitive proof that social policy is dead. I don't agree with that, of course. I think one of the problems of closing the gap is there's just too many things in it, too many indicators. but also it's not funded enough. And when I say too many indicators, they also have land and sea as an indicator. And the government already ticks that off as one of the 4 successful ones out of the 17 or 18, Rachel. I can't remember right now how many. But the land and sea indicator is really odd, because what it means is that the government funds parties to object to native title and to object to statutory land rights. And when that native title or statutory land rights wins in the end, the government notches that up as a win for the government and closing the gap. So they spend millions and millions, billions by now, post-Mabo, challenging Aboriginal land rights and native title. And then when they lose the case, they notch that up for a win for themselves. And so that's one of the indicators that I find it ludicrous people still refer to as one of the indicators that have closed the gap. This economic policy I've written about in the monthly, it's super problematic. I think it's very unusual, having lived for 2 years in the States, that we still live in a country that isn't talking as openly as we should be. I don't know, a lot of people will throw a book at me saying we do all the time, but don't talk as much as we should be about the financialisation of neoliberal democracy. So we know we don't live in a framework of liberal democracy. We know neoliberalism has been the primary model of liberal democracy for a long time. But this end stage, some people call it end stage, this era of capitalism is off the charts. There's a robust discussion about it, of course, in the US, because a vote for the Democrats will be a vote for the Republicans when it comes to the same private equity and capital that are in charge of democracies around the world. And it's just really interesting to see the Albanese government endorse this policy, given all of the kind of negatives and downsides of that policy. Not the least being this, and then I'll try and wrap it up. The least being, they're basically drawing a line in the sand and saying that settler state recognised First Nations people under the Native Title Act are legitimate traditional owners. And if you don't fall under the Native Title Act, you can fend for yourself. My problem with that is that the Mabo decision was very unfair. The Native Title Act was even more unfair. The majority of First Nations people were dispossessed of their land as a consequence of the Mabo decision. And to have an economic empowerment law that only applies to those who had the fortune to live so far away from first contact and so far away from what many historians call the genocide, it's an extraordinary line in the sand and is creating a major schism, a schism that I think is the most significant since 1788, in which a government is actually making a decision about who they think is legitimate and illegitimate Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And that's it's going to be a major thing, especially for the urban dispossessed, who are the majority of the population. Rachel would remember with the Mabo decision, there was a 3-prong settlement, the Mabo Act, so the legislative framework to claim native title, the social justice package, which involved things like constitutional recognition, has never been implemented. Howard dumped it. But the third arm was a reparations package to the dispossessed. That is the First Nations people whose land was dispossessed because Mabo decided that it's too long and Australians have lived on their land and it's extinguished. That reparations package never went to the urban dispossessed. The first iteration of the Indigenous Land and Sea Council decided that it would only go to traditional owner orgs in the north, so traditional owner corporations. Over time, I think they haven't corrected it in a fair way, but they've corrected it by making some payments, etc., to particular urban entities like the National Centre for Indigenous Excellence in Sydney. But it's still an important conversation that urban First Nations people are having about that reparations that was carved out for them that has never, ever gone to them. And I think that's an important part of this conversation. about this new policy that gets very little scrutiny from the media. But when you think about people saying doesn't pass the pub test anymore, Indigenous voice, well, I'm not sure the transfer of huge amounts of millions of dollars of Australian taxpayer money to these kind of elite group will pass the pub test either. And I think the government is just assisted by the fact that the media is by and large reverted to pre-referendum behaviour, and that is not at all interested or curious about what's going on in the Indigenous space. But as the paper I gave to the Centre for Public Integrity last year said, there are so many integrity issues in this space that they're lucky that no one pays attention. So that's by and large the bulk of my comments. I'm sorry I've spoken over. On the Uluru Statement, one of the things I found when I got to Harvard and spent my time in, Philly in America, was they have a very different attitude to political loss. So here I am moping around the campus, and everybody I spoke to and when I presented were like, so that was just an obstacle. What comes next? Like, when are you going for the next referendum? Like, what are you doing to, build solidarity? And what happens next? This happened everywhere, and it really taught me about a different side of the American culture, which is they don't see it as a loss. They see it as a normal political loss, but they see it as a step on the way to getting what you want. And so many people said, you just pick yourself up and keep going, just dust yourself off. And it was an interesting way of coming back to Australia and talking to lots of different mobs who were involved in the dialogues and those who weren't. We will be doing a new series of dialogues next year to see where people are in the 13 sites that we ran the dialogues and how they feel about things. But the Uluru Statement wasn't like a set menu, right? Voice didn't fall over and the next part of the menu's treaty, that doesn't work next menu. That's not how it works. In Australia's federal system, we need a federal voice because the federal government in 1967 was handed that particular responsibility. It holds, it trumps the states on everything. And without a federal voice, people will really struggle, particularly in terms of law reform and policy. Although we have a treaty in Victoria, the substantial part of that is a voice to Parliament, not dissimilar to South Australia. But we're yet to see whether these mechanisms survive a change of government. So, our polling, we're starting to get research coming through, polling a post-referendum Australia. It's not as bad as we thought it would be. There's a bit of buyer's remorse, but there's a lot of Australians saying that the status quo is problematic and an audit's not going to fix that. So we will be pushing on, whether it's a legislated or constitutional voice. Since 1967, every Australian government has had a voice so that it could execute the power that was given to it by the Australian people in 1967. And it just so happens since the abolition of the National Congress of Australia's First Peoples, and especially this government, they seem to think they only have to talk to a very tiny group, teeny tiny group of peak bodies from the Coalition of Peaks to do their work. But the reality is you need First Nations grassroots people directly electing their people, untethered to all of the kind of ideological and political games that are played by political parties and by organisations. So I'll just end my comments there, and people can ask in question time, but I think there are some people calling for a truth process. I think it's the absolute worst time for something like that. What we know from Canada, that's had 4, and most of the world, it doesn't actually lead to better understanding and comprehension of the broader population about your issues. And so with 5 years to run on closing the gap, I think the focus has to be on that.
I'm unmuting and I'll start again. Somebody had to do it, right? It's the rule in a webinar that somebody has to unmute themselves. Thanks, Megan, for your contribution and deep insights. I think we're very privileged to hear from someone who's been involved in these debates for so long, and also can reflect from an international point of view as well. And I'm sure there's going to be lots of questions. Okay, folks, it's over to you for questions. Anybody want to kick off? I'm just looking at the chat. Okay, Chris has got a question. Megan, you gave a compelling analysis of the inadequacy of the truth-telling as a path forward. Sorry, there's lots coming in and it's bumping around. So why do you think we should focus? Why do you think we should focus on a drive to reform? How can we get? Oh, sorry, is it what?
Yes.
Do you think we should focus on in a drive to reform? How can we get a federal voice?
Yeah, so I mean, there's a number of us starting to ramp up for the campaign for a voice. I think, Chris, one of the things that is different to pre-referendum is that we now know that 6.2 million people voted. And of that 40%, we only needed 52% to get across the line. And we lost 10% in the last couple of months, which looked like, from our mapping of the 151 electorates, now 152, was progressive left. So part of the strategy really is just not to rely on going through the front door of Parliament House, right? You've got to do the work with Australian communities and Australians if you're going to get any change on First Nations, anything in this country. And look, that was our original strategy. We didn't end up getting to run the campaign, but that was our original strategy. That was the strategy behind the Uluru Statement from the Heart, was to appeal to Australians as opposed to politicians. And of course, all of that got hijacked. So we can't see how we can function without that federal voice. We will start that work with Australian communities at the same time as working to consider what needs to replace closing the gap. We know there's some disquiet in the government. I think most people can see that it's not working, and it's certainly not a reflection on the really important work of First Nations orgs and people in that space. But it's like a lot of bureaucratic regulatory systems. They're set up to do what they're designed to do, which is really not to function. There are some wins here and there. I think that new hospital deal was a really important one, but by and large, it's not working. So that's where we're headed as the Uluru Dialogue, and engaging with the kind of 6.2 million and our own people. We've been having leadership meetings on this. I think that's my answer. Although truth-telling can be important, there are other ways to do truth-telling that don't involve a big fancy commission. And what we heard in the dialogues was a lot of mobs say, we do truth-telling on a daily basis, and we would like that captured, so that Australians can see the work that's been going on for the past couple of decades between Aussies and mob. We just don't want history to repeat itself, where truth-telling is not a structural reform, and nor does it deliver the kinds of reforms people think it does. We need structural, substantive reform to make a difference.
Thank you. Marsha, you've got a comment, you've got a question in the chat. Do you actually want to come on? Do you want to come on and ask it, or do you want me to? All right, I think I might ask it then. There's a question here for Michelle. If Michelle believes that peaceful protest is ineffective in driving actual structural change, in her view, what would effective advocacy for structural change look like? A peaceful process, not a fundamentally important tool in affecting structural change. For example, Gandhi in the 1930s with British colonial India, the civil rights movement in the US.
Okay, thanks very much for the question. It's always great to have an opportunity to clarify what I meant in my remarks. So look, peaceful protest is, in my view, an ineffable right in a democracy, and it's incredibly important. And actually, the attack on peaceful protests that we're seeing now, for example, in New South Wales. There are some in Victoria who would like to follow suit. The effort to clamp down. So protest itself becomes something that we have to fight for. So it's not that I think that peaceful protest is not worthwhile or not incredibly important to defend. And I say that also as a veteran of many protests myself over the years. But I do think that there is a difference between protest and activism, and between strategizing for what I would consider to be actual structural change. Let me come to the end of your question, because I think that's interesting. So you said, look, the civil rights movement in the US, and Gandhi in British colonial India, that these were examples of peaceful protest. But I would say actually what they were examples of was activism. So when Rosa, I can't think of her surname, my goodness. What is it, Amy?
Parks, Rosa Parks.
Thank you. Oh my God, what a memory, especially for a Yankee like me. When Rosa Parks gets on the bus, what she's doing as a form of activism is actually breaking the law. Okay? And therefore she's challenging a structure, which is the law that says that if you're an African American at that point, if you were a Black American, that you couldn't ride in the front of the bus. I look at people who think, that collectivism is as far as they need to go now, when they sign a Get Up petition and, feel good. And I think really we need more. I would rather see people joining the local branch of the Labour Party if they think the Labour Party's not getting it right, if the Labour Party's gone lame, as Amy said earlier, I would rather see people joining the local branch of their Labour Party, and getting serious. The Teal movement is actually a good example of people, wherever your politics lie. That to me was a good example of fairly local grassroots campaigns actually trying to mobilize to mount some sort of challenge. So my only point is not to say that protest has its place, and it has its place in terms of voicing what people need to say around challenging the status quo, and mounting an alternative. But protest in and of itself is not sufficient. It's an important element, but it's not a sufficient element to actually drive change. If you want to drive change, you have to challenge law, you have to challenge economic structures, you have to be able to challenge social attitudes, and get people doing differently, not just thinking differently or saying differently. So it's the difference between protest versus activism that I was really trying to get at.
And if I could just add to that from the political context as well, I mean, if protest and activism was not effective, they would not try so hard to ban it. And the fact that they are trying so hard to ban it now, sorry, Michelle.
That's right. I completely agree, Amy. But sorry, your remark has reminded me of one more thing that I wanted to say. So, we are one of the historical demonstrations of the power of agitating for change comes from a long history of radicalism, okay, different than radicalization. Radicalism has delivered to us, many, what many of us would consider positive social change in terms of things like women's rights, electoral enfranchisement, and so forth in different parts of the world. But it's very sobering to reflect, as I was recently with in another piece of work, on who gets to claim the mantle of being truly radical these days. And the answer is the far right. Okay? The far and the extreme right are currently the radicals of our day, and they are doing something with it. They are the ones who are driving absolutely foundational, transformational change. And they are doing it through law, and they are doing it through media, which is another really critical structure, in societies like ours. They are doing it in terms of social values and social organization, literally, and I'm thinking here around all the stuff around gender, like, and where's where's everybody else? So the people we used to, when Trump says, oh, the crazy radical lunatic left, I'm like, really? Because you look to me like you're a part of the most effective radical movement of the day. Now, that should really make us, that should give us pause. And I think the question that has to be asked is, well, the radical right is making merry and driving through a heap of structural change. What are we going to do about it? And how are we going to do it? Those are the pressing questions for me at the moment.
Yeah. The problem with the Australian political space, which is being, I think, probably extrapolated across like most neoliberal Western democracies like the US and the UK, is that any sort of progressive or left movements are being targeted very heavily by governments in trying to tone down dissent, whereas it is at least seen as if the response to the far right and that radicalism is not being met with the same level of government action. That is, again, by design. The Australian government likes to use left and progressive issues to ban protests, to ban everyone, because a lot of them, when you speak privately to them, will say that they're worried about causing some sort of revolt within the far right by deliberately targeting the far right so that they will use leftist causes. But that doesn't mean that protest and standing back up against that and that sort of activism against the far right doesn't also work. I mean, political scientist, I think it's Erica Chenoweth, has the 3.5% rule, which is 3.5% of a population being involved protesting and activism is enough to change a regime. Not in all cases, but it does get things moving. I think a great recent example of that in Australia is the March for Humanity that happened across the Sydney Harbour Bridge. Lo and behold, a government that had been refusing to recognise Palestine suddenly recognised Palestine at the United Nations. They didn't do that for any other reason than they saw that march as a tipping point. And governments will always use protest and dissenters, particularly from the left, and claim that they're being radical, they're being uncivil, that they're being disruptive. But at the same time, they will refer to previous civil rights movements and previous democratic dissenters, like the suffragettes, like what we saw in civil rights, anyone who's fought for something in the past and won. They talk about that with rose-colored glasses as something that we should be very proud of, particularly in Australia. But the same people who are protesting very similar causes now are treated with contempt. And in the future, that will be repeated. They will treat the people protesting now against all sorts of, against the attack on civil liberty, against the inequality, against what's happening, on genocide, what's happening in Indigenous rights. They will treat those people in the future as having stood for a moral line, and they will start to crack down on whatever it is that they're protesting in the future. Probably still Indigenous recognition and also AI and whatever the tech bros have done to our society. So I think it's also important to remember that governments never like dissent. Governments always use progressive causes and the left as sort of the headline to ban the dissent, and they're never truly going to treat the far right as seriously as they should, partly because they don't like to believe that these movements are happening, because in their circles they're not. And that sort of disconnect, and as Megan has also touched on with the media as well, is another something that people have to contend with moving forward in this space.
Thank you. I'm going to go to Jodie.
Thank you, Rachel. Sorry, got a nasty cold, so sounding a bit horrid. But I just wanted to do a big shout out to all our speakers. Absolutely incredible. Just to comment, I think on that last before I ask my question to Megan. I think there's a really fascinating movement around. I read an interesting book, which I'm sure most of you have read, The Persuaders by Anand Giridharadas, and talking about the social structures that the Republicans have built up since the 50s, mainly around the American gun lobby and the rifle associations, where the social movements and social constructs were actually built out, not within direct political spheres or direct political party environments, but through social environments, and that the Republican movement or the left has not kept up with the social constructs to enable those debates and discussions, which I thought was absolutely fascinating and a lot to learn from. But to my question that I wrote up, Megan, thank you. And I did say that I'm very pleased to hear the Americans gave you a dust off, because we need you more than ever. I obviously am the CEO at REC WA, and I absolutely agree that the movement, I think we're at moments in time where we need to reflect on our impact and what our broader community can do to uplift. But how do you see the movement supporting you for the fight for that representation, which you talked to? And also, as we always say, mob have been truth-telling since colonization. We're just not particularly good truth listeners. So I'd love to hear your reflections on that, and give us a kick up the bum, please.
Thanks, and hi, Jodie. It's nice to see you.
You too.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to say to Michelle that it was really interesting to me being there and hearing lots of stories about solidarity. And this is one of my pet peeves with the climate change movement at the moment, was take, for example, African American men and the suffragettes have to work together in order to get what they wanted. I mean, our suffragettes, that didn't happen because Australia has such a deeply racist, constitution. And those attitudes at the time were so deeply embedded in the Australian political space. And I don't think we ever talk about that enough, about how deeply racist Australia's constitutional system is. It's very different to the US. I know people have these ideas that the US is just a big racist, crazy place, and it's not. And so there's some amazing books that really made me think about the ways in which groups that are opposed had to work together. The suffragettes had to dump their racist discourse for them both to work together. And I think about that in the context of lots of left causes right now in Australia that still won't talk about what happened in 2023. And I keep picking on climate change, but still talk about disinformation, but won't say, oh, actually, that's what happened in 2023. It wasn't just X, Y, Z, the number of different excuses people have as to why that happened. And can I just add on, because I didn't talk about it, but the racism that was rained upon our people in 2023 was so extreme. It was so extreme. And, the people used to post nooses and guns and all on Twitter, all in plain sight, right? There was so much political violence. Some of the things that happened, I can't even repeat. And, I remember being in Philly when Bondi happened and thinking, what did you think was going to happen when you allowed all of those Hansonites, all of those far-right racists to just do whatever they wanted and say whatever they wanted in 2022, 2023? Albanese said that he would not tolerate. He went to Ghana in 2022 and said he would not tolerate racism in the referendum. His government said nothing about the racism, nothing. And then wonder why these people feel emboldened. I mean, it's extraordinary. And then, the day after the vote, just silence from the entire polity. It's no wonder everybody stayed at home and kept their kids at home. It's an unsafe space in your own country. And I think part of the work we're trying to do is to try and get people to start talking about it, because they've all got in their brain. I mean, I remember fighting with someone on Substack the other day, Amy, some bloke just saying, oh, no, the ANU survey says that, no, it was just a bad model. And disinformation happens in all elections. That's what he said in an essay about disinformation and climate change. Oh, yeah, but the Voice is different. Disinformation happens in all elections. And I'm like, hang on, dude, you can't be asymmetrical about how you apply these conditions. So I think, Jodie, it's a good question. And it's a question that we're thinking about and starting to talk to allies about, because we need to shore up those conversations and that solidarity before we think about moving again. And as I said, the kind of judicious thinking of elders in 13 sites and then at Uluru and other mob involved was that we knew that this had to come through the people, that it couldn't come through politics, because politics is always a shut door. So I learned a lot in America about solidarity movements, and things that we just weren't, like I said, I didn't run the campaign, but things we just weren't thinking about. We've learned a lot from that first loss and only loss. We've learned a lot. But one of those things is to get, if we can get climate change space acknowledging what happened in 2023, that's a big shift, I think. And that notion that our liberation is wrapped up in yours. If we can't get proper climate change politics in your space, when everybody can feel what's going on and everybody can see what's going on, then it's never going to happen for us either. And so we need to work together more. Anyway, I don't know if that answered your question, Jodie.
No, other than just to say thank you. And there's many people, I think it's not enough, but it was 35% of the country said yes, and we can't forget that momentum and we can't let go of that momentum. And I want to say in the West that we are talking in a different language since the referendum. We're saying anti-racism. Government is talking about anti-racism. It wasn't being talked about before the referendum, but I feel that there is acknowledgement and language shift. And I've got to say, post 26th of January Boorloo attack, terrorist attack, there is, I think, a substantial shift in narrative around it. And I'm so sad that it takes those events to make those shifts, but we are driving very hard to make sure that that isn't lost. So thank you.
I think the anti-racism framework's a problem, though. I mean, I think what's going on in Australia, we've got a lot of left kind of frameworks that are really problematic.
Yeah.
But we don't have to talk about that now.
Michelle.
I was just reflecting on something that Megan has been talking about. I mean, for me, the strategy, Megan, that you've just been outlining about bringing climate change and Indigenous rights together. I mean, to me, that's an excellent example of a kind of, a strategic activism in the most positive sense of that term, because what it's helping to identify is it's a common threat, right? Climate change is a common threat that nevertheless has different consequences and implications, right? That you can sort of start to unpack that. And I think that what you're pointing to is the importance, especially in a time where it is becoming increasingly hard for people to identify across different lines of identification with one another, to be able to find those things where people say, yes, I can find myself and my cause in this frame, right? That is a wonderful strategy to be able to do it. It's not the most morally desirable, in the sense that it would be nice if people were able to get to the issues that the Voice was trying to get across on their own. But I think history shows us that it's exactly that kind of activism and the finding of that common ground that is actually one of the most powerful engines for social and political change.
Rach, if I can just jump in, sorry, I'm jumping in over Amy. I just wanted to make one really quick point, and that is, and the challenge for us is to get allies to listen, because I think part of the left that peeled away was people saying, oh, no, we wanted a treaty. Like, we didn't want voice. We want sovereignty, or we wanted this, and now they're saying, let's do truth. And I'm like, no one could just sit and breathe and think, oh, actually that process for 2 years was a self-determining process. And yes, it's sure Lydia didn't like it, and sure 10 to 15% of mob didn't like it, and they were very loud on social media, etc. But after the election, and you look at the Northern Territory, every ballot box voted yes. It was like a 90% yes. The AEC did the overlay, and 85% of mob right across the continent voted yes. And even now, this kind of, oh, it's time to move to treaty and truth. And I'm like, can you just wait? Can you just wait? Can you just take a breath? And because every time, so for example, with treaty, when we did the dialogues, treaty didn't come up first for all sorts of complex reasons. When New South Wales are doing their treaty process now, the treaty commissioners have found mob aren't sure. There's no overwhelming yes. They're saying, oh, we're not sure. We're not sure it fits, and we don't know what treaty is. And there's this idea, just because activists push treaty, that has been the dominant thing we want, when in fact we've been pushing for a better mandated role in democracy since the early 1800s. That's not long after first contact, but nobody listens.
Yeah,
So I'm going to.
Sorry, just very quickly. I was just going to say the difference to me, though, in what you've just pointed out, you've got an evidence base that says that treaty was not the first thing that came up in those consultations, and then on the other hand, you've got, as you say, some loud activists saying it's, basically it's treaty or bust. And this is when I think you start to get into the territory of the kind of misinformation. It's not disinformation,
100%.
but it's misinformation about, and people on the outside going, well, this must be how all Indigenous people feel, right?
100%.
Yeah.
That was a separate point, but yeah, you're correct.
Amy, you wanted to make a comment, and I'm going to move us on to the next question. If that's okay.
I was just going to say to some of Megan's points on the climate movement, and I always get in trouble for this, and Rachel, you've been sitting next to me when I've said it before, but part of the issues the climate movement has in Australia is that it puts a priority and a preference on access to government, particularly when it's a Labor government, and they tend to think that if they just toe the line and use that access to, pose with photos with whoever the environment minister is, Murray Watt, or get in the rooms, that is the same as having impact and influence. And it truly is time for civil society in Australia to get uncivil and to stop being so civil when it comes to dealing with power and with the government. And I think the climate movement is a perfect example of that, because we currently have, separate to what Megan's talking about in the Indigenous space, we currently have Gina Rinehart, who is financing disinformation campaigns through actors like Advance, that are of course part of the Atlas network, that have done so much to ruin Indigenous rights across colonized nations, as well as destroy the climate debate. I mean, they pretty much celebrate what they've done in Australia when it comes to the voice, as well as what they've done with climate, right? So we've got Gina Rinehart, who's funding that. At the same time as Gina Rinehart is becoming, I think she's the second biggest player in critical minerals outside of China currently. So she's making bank while also destroying any sort of climate movement in Australia. And we never pay any attention to power in this country. We don't pay attention to how
100%.
infiltrates, how power is used, and to all of those like shadowy, powerful figures. And instead, what we have is, movements, left movements or progressive movements that tend to think that being in the room is enough. And I think we have had decades to show that no, being in the room doesn't mean jack if you're not actually having proper influence and impact. And that doesn't necessarily come from up top. A lot of the time that comes from having to connect to that groundswell underneath it. And I'm not sure whether, especially in the climate space, the activist leaders in the climate space have actually recognized what is happening in that groundswell. There's a disconnect, I think, between leadership in the climate movement and what is happening on the ground.
Thanks. That's a really good summation and end to that bit of that conversation, I think. If that's okay, we move on to another area, and that is, although it's still part of the same discussion, actually. Do you have, this is to Megan and Michelle, but Amy, feel free to jump in as well. Do you have any reflections on the intersections between increasing polarization and extremism linked to global conflicts and continued and increasing racism targeting Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples? It feels like people feel an increase in permission stroke entitlement to lash out at mob.
Did you want to go first, Megan, or would you like me to say something?
I mean, you can go first. That's cool.
Yeah. All right. Look, I'll be brief on this. I think that yes, there is certainly an intersection between increasing polarization and extremism. And it is true to say that there has been a global surge in both the normalization of things that might have formerly been considered extreme have now, started edging closer, as I said earlier, to being normalized as mainstream. We have certainly seen polarization on many levels. But I would say that the connection that you're asking us to consider here in terms of continued and increasing racism targeting Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, for me, the issue is that there is increasing permissiveness around hate. Okay, that's what's being legitimated, and there are multiple targets. And Aboriginal, and so the social license to even if you felt racist sentiments, not to articulate them, that's what's been loosened. Yes, and I think Megan will, have a lot more to say about this perhaps than I can. But we are not just seeing it in that domain. We are seeing it in many other domains as well. So it's like it feels like open season. And you can, but I don't know that I don't know that I would want to say that it's linked only to global conflicts. I tend to see it as more of a dynamic that has to do with a sort of pendulum swing where people felt it was not permissible to say anything. Now they're going for broke and saying, no, I'm going to, untether myself, from the social constraints. But it is also being driven and empowered by social media in the sense that people are no longer being forced to be accountable for what they say and who they say it to. So they're not having to attach their names and their faces to many different forms of hate speech, hate narrative, and so forth. So I think part of the underlying trend around that kind of hateful discourse aimed at Indigenous, but also a number of other groups, has to do with the relaxation, if you like, of social accountability of the kind that you get in the face-to-face encounter. But I'll stop my comment there.
Thank you.
Megan,
did you want to?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question, Christina, because I think it's true that people feel a permissiveness pre-referendum, but especially post-referendum, to lash out at mob. And I think it is probably connected to polarization, extremism, and etc. But I mean, for me, it's always been the way in Australia, right? I mean, we've had to put up with Hansonism for 38 years. Who's the primary target of Hanson? This is 40 years of that shit. Racist shit where you put her on fucking breakfast television and everybody pretends like she's not a racist. I remember emailing or texting Annabelle Crabb when I was in Philly because Barnaby Joyce had jumped ship and her op-ed didn't mention racism once. They literally write articles in Australia and do not mention that One Nation Party is racist, their policies are racist, and she is a racist. And so that's 40 years, going back 40 years when I was, in grade 8. I was in Beenleigh, the opposite line to Ipswich. But, I was in grade 7 or something and having to put up with that crap as a child, meaning racism's so normalised in Australia that we just think, oh, look, the winds of change and polarisation. No, this is who we are. It's just we never talk about it. And I'm looking forward to your podcast, Amy, because I think it needs to be unpacked. Because not one journalist asked Barnaby Joyce, are you a racist? You're joining a racist party? And now because I know the polls went up, the polls are coming down, but and possibly, probably because people see what her policies are. But when I was in Philly, I went onto her website. What are the first policies that are there? They're about Aboriginal people. Who is going to bear the brunt of her popularity? Aboriginal people. She's abolishing the agency. She's abolishing all Aboriginal money. She's Aboriginal, like that is what that party is about. And I just feel like, and I know I'm a broken record, but I just feel like Australia still doesn't grapple with the depth of racism in our DNA as public. I don't mean Aussies, but I mean the public institutions and our constitution. I don't know. We just don't have that conversation. And I really don't want to talk about Henry Reynolds. Why weren't we told? We were told. We knew. We have parliamentary inquiries in the pre-Federation period and post-Federation period. I don't want to hear people go on about Stanner. They all quote Stanner and then move on happily like they're intellectuals and, the silence and the silence. Yeah, but you don't care enough, really, to line up with us. So that's my kind of answer to your question. I'm not sure if it's a satisfactory answer, but I see us looking, and certainly when I was at Harvard, I mean, that sounds elitist, but in America, in Boston, watching what was going on in Australia and thinking, we think we're so smug about our liberal democracy, but at least the Yanks have the guts to talk about race and racism. At least that's a really open conversation there, whether it's racist, whether it's not. I mean, partly I understand the scale of 300 million people. I understand what free press looks like, right? We have a very concentrated media that is owned mostly by Murdoch. Over there, it's just refreshing to hear, different stations, different radios, different newspapers, and it's a whole different ballgame. But I just think on race, it's still our people that just get ignored and thrown under the bus, and we still don't have those conversations. And like I said, we can talk about draconian laws today. Where do you think they came from? They were all practiced on our people. This is who we are as a nation. And to that end, Rachel, I know you don't want me to say anything about anything else. I just wanted to make the point to Amy that when I said to people, where the hell are we mentioned in that, information ecosystem climate change report? And I got told by different centres, we can't mention you because we want to lobby the Liberals. And then we got told by the other side, we can't mention you because the Labor government doesn't agree with that, and so we don't want to put it. So that's why we're absent from everything. And what do we do when we're written out of the entire story because the people who are in the room with the Voice won't talk about us because they don't get to be in the room? And so I think what you said was a really important point. And last point, Rachel, I promise, and I'll shut up. But I think the law, a few people have made the point about the law. Race is encoded in the law in the same way that capital is. And I just wanted to make the point, there's a really great book called Jim Crow's Legal Executioners. It's a fantastic book, but it talks about how race was encoded in Jim Crow. I know it's not an Australian book, but it's a really useful book for understanding Australia. The other one is The Code of Capital by Katarina Pistol. She talks about the way capital is, the way in which, the law and governments are not separate to capital. There's no such thing as the private market that's separate to the state. The state dictates it, the state regulates it, the state runs the laws. And I think we don't think enough about that when we're thinking about some of these issues, is how those legal structures create this. And the last thing I'll put in the chat is that American philosopher Olafemi Taiwo about in-the-room privilege. We use it in Aboriginal affairs all the time because that's what government's created for closing the gap. If you're in the room, if you're privileged enough to be a CEO of a particular, corporation that delivers services for government, you might be in the room. But by and large, government never comes face-to-face with community, ever. They are not in the room. That's the beauty of direct election and voting and self-determination, is that you can vote your own people and get them into the room. And so I thought Amy made a really good, important point, which is I think where we're coming to in terms of liberal democracy is we're just too disconnected from those people who we elect. And beyond the ballot box, we have no mechanisms really to have citizen input. And that's where I think the voice was prescient. I think the voice will one day be an idea that will come. All it was wanting our own people elected directly in that room and telling government whether or not something suits their own community. And it's not told to them by someone who has a fancy pass to Canberra, but it's told by, Arnie Mabel, who lives in Burke. That's what you want. I'll shut up, Rach, because I'm ranting now. I can keep ranting on and on.
Yeah, I do know that. Thank you so much, Megan. You are telling us like it is. So, that's really important and really valuable. So thank you. We are coming to the end of our session. Thank you. And I know there's still questions, but we're running out of time. I'd like to ask everyone to join me in thanking Amy, Michelle, and Megan for their amazing contributions. There are some really tough things that we've talked about today, and we are in tough times. These are things that we have to be talking about, and it impacts on the work that all of us do because it sets that political context in which we are operating and supporting the people that are furthest from the levers of power and that are the ones that are affected by the decisions that are made. And that's why we also need to be engaged in these discussions so we understand that context in which we are operating. I can't thank you enough, Amy and Michelle and Megan, for a really stimulating conversation. And I, for one, could sit here for another couple of hours having these discussions, but I know that people have to get on with their work. But I think into the future, we may, if I can indulge this, organise other forums where we can continue these discussions that are really important for us to hear and understand the context, as I said, in which we are operating, and in particular in the current circumstances the world is facing at the moment. So thank you so much. And Megan, you didn't carry on. You made really, really good contribution for us to understand what has happened and where we're going and where we need to go.
Thanks so much, Rachel. I've really enjoyed this. It's been a privilege to be here alongside Megan and Amy. And I'll leave you with the parting comment, that I think I reckon we need to think about changing the room. So thanks again for having me. Cheers.
Thanks, everybody.